Good morning and welcome to the Summit to End Homelessness. My name is Sherry Jones and I anchor the 6 and 11 o'clock newscasts at WLNS TV 6 in Lansing. I am honored to serve as your MC for this virtual summit. The pandemic has changed the way that we go about our normal lives. We've had to adapt to socializing and conducting business virtually. And with that being said, special thanks to the Summit Committee for adapting to our new normal to plan this virtual summit. The sessions today and tomorrow will be presented by dynamic speakers who are both local and national experts. And we're excited to have presentations today on topics such as responding to COVID-19 and working with the LGBTQ community. We have a special session this afternoon at 1 o'clock with Brett Esders and Mark Sorbo from HUD. But before we begin, I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work, your dedication, and your advocacy in your local communities. We are confident that at the end of this conference, you will hear ideas, make new connections, and leave with a renewed energy to continue the work to end homelessness. The conference begins with our keynote speaker, Regina Cannon, a morning break, 4 breakout sessions, and then a break for lunch. Please refer to the schedule that was sent to you, or you can check the schedule on the website for a link to today's sessions. So let's get started. I'm excited to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. Her name is Regina Cannon, and she is the Chief Equity and Impact Officer at C4 Innovations. She has dedicated her career to being a vocal, active leader, fighting for equitable policies, systems, and institutions, and addressing marginalization of people of color. She has more than 18 years of experience leading anti-poverty initiatives, addressing homelessness, supportive housing, criminal justice reform, community capacity building, and youth leadership development. Previously, Regina was Southeast Director for Corporation for Supportive Housing, where she worked with communities to transform systems of care into data and performance-driven systems that provide sustainable, permanent housing to those experiencing homelessness. She managed a large portfolio of initiatives across multiple sectors, addressing frequent user service enhancement or FUSE with healthcare and criminal justice partners. Moving on with public housing authorities and supportive housing development with nonprofit organizations and local developers. Regina has managed mental health and drug court programs, as well as restorative board programs for young adults engaged with the criminal justice system. She was also an assistant professor at Bennett College. We are thrilled to hear Regina speak on lessons learned from 2020 and how to apply them. So please welcome Regina Cannon.
Good morning. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today. I would like to thank the committee for inviting me to speak with you. So, we want to talk today a little bit about change versus transformation. And why is this so important at this time in our history? We think about what's going on every single day and across our last 8 months, and we've had this convergence of pandemics. We've had the pandemic of COVID-19, and we've had the long-standing pandemic of racism 20. Yes, I know what you're saying, that we've had that pandemic for, 400 years. But it's been something very unique and special about the kind of pandemic that we've seen this year, the kind of racism that we've seen this year, the publicized murders and killings of Black people this year, and now how it has converged with COVID-19. Because I think that there was special awareness paid to this. The awareness was heightened. Our attention was focused because we were sheltering in place. We didn't have a lot of other things that we could be doing. And so our minds and our hearts were in horror as we watched things going on in the streets that perhaps we'd never watched before. And so we had some lessons learned from that convergence that I want to share with you, because I think that always, even between two horrors, we can find a sliver of hope. And so I want to walk through that today. I want us to learn a few lessons and then walk through that sliver of hope. So come with me on this journey. Lessons learned. So we learned quite a few things. We learned that it was important that we have data that was disaggregated, that we have data that we could understand who was being most harmed, whether it was by COVID-19 or by police brutality. But we needed to disaggregate that data. And why did we have to fight for it? If you'll recall, the first data that came out about COVID-19, it was just a big summary of data saying who was saying these were the cases and these were the deaths. But for those of us who were fighting for racial justice, we said, hold up. We see something here. We see that the conditions that seem to be fostering COVID-19 are disproportionately recognized within Black and brown communities. So we need to understand better, what are the numbers? What communities are being disproportionately attacked by COVID-19? And so we needed that disaggregated data. And we found out something very painful, but perhaps not surprising, that Black and Indigenous folks were actually dying at rates higher than any other group from COVID-19. What else did we learn? We learned that we needed to put this kind of data in context. Because see, if we allow these numbers to just get out, if we just say, well, my gosh, Black and brown folks are dying at higher rates, it would be very easy to say, well, you know what, they don't take care of themselves, or they have weak bodies, or this and that, and to try to blame individuals or a population rather than putting the blame where it should be, and that's on the systems of inequity, which created the conditions that made folks more vulnerable, put them at a higher risk of this insidious virus, COVID-19. So let's take a look for a moment at those. And so when you think about those historical things that were in place for COVID-19, one, look at location. Black and brown folks live in places that are nearer factories, that are closer to pollution, every single day breathing this in. And so that condition of respiratory diseases, guess who has that most often? And so it wasn't as though Black and brown people said, well, gosh, we want to live in a place where there's a lot of pollution so that we can get asthma. No, this was by design. We had this segregation over time. We had places where Black and brown folks were not allowed to even live. We had their communities that were underinvested in, but we didn't mind putting industrial complexes beside them, right? So that they could breathe in all of that poison. And of course, that was going to affect their bodies. So we want to make sure that we put that in context. When we think about other things like diabetes and hypertension, let's take them one at a time. Hypertension. So just recently, we have begun to do these studies around toxic stress. When we began to look at those things around why do we have a higher rate of infant mortality and maternal deaths among Black women and Black children. And finally, folks are beginning to believe us because they've done the research that it's not because of our economic status, and sometimes it's not even whether or not we have health care. It is the kind of toxic stress that comes from the everyday burden of racism, not race. Let's be clear here. It's not a burden of race. It is a burden of racism, and that kind of toxic stress that leaks throughout our bodies. And so it's the same here with COVID-19 and that kind of hypertension, all of those pre-existing conditions that we have that are because of historical and contemporary discrimination and racism that put us at so much risk for COVID-19. So we needed to make sure that we learned that lesson, that we always put numbers and percentages in context. What else did we learn? We learned that across the whole gamut, that no matter what we looked at, whether it was at health, whether it was our law enforcement, that systemic racism, it was the constant. It showed up everywhere. And it was only during this pandemic that we really began to pull back the curtain and see where it was showing up in every aspect of our lives. And yes, even in the housing system, even in the homelessness response system, in which every single one of us dedicate our lives to trying to make sure that everyone has stable and safe housing in communities where they can thrive. Yes, even within our system, racism was rearing its ugly head. And so we wanted to make sure that we were taking the time to begin to peel that back, to interrogate every single point, every point of entry into our homeless response system. We needed to interrogate it all the way from outreach and even in-reach, our intake system, how we assess people. Do we start with strengths or do we start with assumed deficits? Do we make sure that people have the kind of referrals to the housing that they need? Or is it the housing that we think they need or the housing that we want them to have? Do we make sure that they have access to the kind of supports that they need that are culturally responsive and not just a cookie cutter service? Do we make sure that we continue to follow up with them and make sure that they're reconnecting to community? Because what was that lesson that we learned during this pandemic? Community is everything. Think of the loss that we felt when we were without community. Let's take that lesson and make sure that we're helping people to reconnect community, those that are experiencing homelessness, that we're helping them to find new communities or reconnect to old communities, because that's life-giving. So are we doing all of those things? Are we taking into account these lessons that we've learned? What else did we learn? We learned that protest and advocacy works. I know you have so much to do every single day. The work is hard when we're talking about the homeless response system. We've been asked to do so much with so little, but we cannot ignore the fact that some things that are going on in our society are just wrong. They're unjust, and that we must begin to protest against them. We must begin to advocate for a more just system. That has to be part of our responsibility to those that we serve. And here's the thing, it works. We have to do both, not only walking in the streets in protest and in the uprising, but we must also figure out what are those best policies and regulations and practices that we should be advocating for. And we should be going to our city council meetings, to our county commission meetings, to our state legislators and advocating. We need to be making sure that we're singing with one voice that housing is a right. Let's say that again. Housing is a right. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be advocating for, because it will work if we rise up together in full voice, full-throated voice together. That's one of the lessons that we learned. And unfortunately, we had a lesson that we learned very quickly. You see, we learned that when we come together, whether it's in the protest or advocacy work, that backlash will be swift. So we must stay vigilant. What do I mean by that? Some of you may or may not be familiar with the term white lash. You see, every time Black and brown folks begin to make a little progress, there's a swift white lash that comes in. Let me give you a historical example, and then we'll give you a recent one. Historically, after the Civil War, as we were going through the period of Reconstruction, during that time, we had more Black legislators than ever in history, yes, including in 2020. We had Black cities that were coming up all over the country. We had some wealth building. We had Black banks. We had Black doctors and lawyers. We had whole cities. That was a little bit too much. So what happened? White vigilante groups began to actually burn down those Black communities. They killed Black folks, left them in the street. Yeah. To this day, we are still finding graves of those folks from the summer, that red summer of 1919, and then just a couple of years later in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when Black Wall Street was burned down. Because you see, when Black and brown folks take a couple of steps forward and step into their own agency, there's a swift white lash. And so fast forward to today. The protests were working. We had communities that were actually interrogating their law enforcement, their criminal justice systems. They were beginning to think about how to reimagine public safety. And what happened? We had literally folks that marched into state capitals with their automatic weapons, threatening to shut down the meetings that were going on there. We had folks walking through the streets, literally killing protesters, all in the name of protecting buildings. Because you see, they realized something, that Black and brown folks of all walks of life, as well as other white folks, were all coming together and shouting in one voice that we want justice, we will have justice, we demand justice. And then we had, as usual, that group of white folks who just couldn't take it. And so they too hit the streets. And we had this kind of white lash. And so I want to make sure that we stay vigilant, that we don't get comfortable, that every day we keep fighting, and that we expect that white lash that will come against us, that backlash that says, wait, you've gone too far, you have gotten out of your place. But we will not stop. What else did we learn? We learned that neutrality is not an option. You see, Desmond Tutu said many years ago, he said that you're either on the side of the oppressor or the side of those being oppressed. And so in this moment, there is no neutrality. You have to choose a side. There is not saying, well, gosh, I'll let those folks take care of it. Or maybe if we can just sit this out, things will get better, things will go back to normal. No, neutrality cannot be an option. Everybody has to get in this fight. Everyone has to choose a side. So you either choose the side of the oppressor or you choose the side of those that are being oppressed, and you fight with and for them. That was the lesson that we learned. But we also learned something very incredible. See, we learned that transformation is possible. Yes, transformation is possible. We learned that in the midst of this pandemic, COVID-19, that we had folks of every race and ethnicity, of every identity, every gender identity, every single demographic that you can think of. We had them to come together in our streets. Even in this time where they were risking their lives, they put their mask on and they began to walk through the streets and said, we will have justice. See, we saw a coming together like we have never seen before. Even in the civil rights movement, we did not have this kind of group of folks to come together and sustained that night after night after night after night, everyone coming out together. You see, that's what it's going to take for true transformation to take place. For no one to sit on the sidelines, but for everyone to see themselves in the eyes of others. And that's what we were able to accomplish over these last months. But see, that's just the beginning. It's just the beginning. We can't stop. We can't let up. We have to keep in mind this notion that change fixes the past, but transformation creates the future. I want to say that again to you. Change fixes the past, but transformation creates the future. And so we want to make sure that we're walking into this new future together, that we're designing this new future with this new coalition that we have. You see, I've been hearing for the last 5, 6, 7 months, gosh, we'll be so glad when COVID-19 is over so that we can go back to normal. Folks, we're not going back to normal. Normal was not working for Black folks, for Indigenous folks, for people of color, for LGBTQ folks. So we're not going back to normal any longer. We're going to go into a new world together. And we're going to try to leave behind all of that hatred that we had, all of those systems that were not working for all of us. We're going to leave those behind and walk into this new future together. So I want to work with you today and figure out how we can envision this new system, how we can set this new vision. So let's go one by one. Think of this. We want to imagine a system that's built on those that are most marginalized. Yeah. Because you see, every other system has been built to benefit those that were in power, but that can be no longer. We want to build the kinds of systems that speak to those that have been left behind, those that have been harmed. We want to build a system for those that we have been looking away from, for those that we have deemed invisible. We want to build a system for them, because see, if we build that system for them and with them, we have built a system for everyone. So we want to start there. We want to make sure that this new system, this new world that we're building together, that we do not default into those old white dominant cultural norms that were always there throughout our society. Let's take an example. That dominant cultural norm of paternalism and charity, that has no place in our new society, because see, everyone has agency and power to build their own lives. So we don't need paternalism. We don't need somebody else telling us what to do. We want partnerships. We want full partnerships and collaboration, not paternalism. Secondly, when we look at those dominant cultural norms that we need to walk away from, we need to think about how transactional we have always been in this society. We don't want that any longer, like just doing something because we're going to get something back from it. We need to have these kind of transformational relationships and interactions with each other. Those kind of interactions and relationships where we actually see each other, where we actually look at each other and see the value and the dignity of the folks that are standing with us and by us and in front of us, and not in a transactional, what can we get from this, but about what can we build together from this. So we want to make sure that we do not, in our new world that we're creating, that we do not default back into those white dominant cultural norms that all of us have played into these many years, these many centuries. We want to look at our outcomes. We want to make sure that we're thinking about socioeconomic outcomes, that we're literally thinking about, are they different? For those of us in the homeless response system, do we have less people that are returning to homelessness? Are we making sure that the length of time that people spend homeless is decreasing, and especially for those of color, because they have disproportionately experienced homelessness? Are we actually getting to root causes in this new world? Are we still just nibbling around the edges? Are we actually looking at the factors, at the contributing factors that put people at risk for homelessness? Or are we just sort of trying to put a Band-Aid on it when surgery is actually needed? Because see, in this new world that we're creating, in this new system that we're creating, we've got to have surgery, folks. Band-Aids won't do. In this new world, we need to understand what leadership should look like. We need to understand that it is no longer an option that our leadership should look white. I want to give you a few stats here. When we look across our nonprofits, those that are serving those that have been disproportionately left out, 90% of our executive directors in those nonprofits are white. So the leadership, our management teams look white, yet you are serving those that are disproportionately black and brown. How can that make sense? It doesn't. So we want to make sure that in this new world, our leadership is reflective of those that we are serving. It is reflective of this new coalition. Because let me share this with you, black and brown folks, you see, we're already the global majority, and we will soon be the majority here in these United States, and our leadership should reflect that. What will our decision-making process look like in this new world? Because see, in our old world, in this current system that we work in, many times we'll bring a black or brown person or LGBTQ person to the table, but we don't really give them any authority to make decisions. We tokenize them. But see, in this new world that we're creating together, tokenism is no longer acceptable. Everyone will have a role in making decisions. Everyone will be able to put their ideas and their thoughts on the table and be a part of saying, yes, this is the way forward, that we are now making decisions for us, not a small group of folks that have always been in power. Yeah, so we better talk about power, right? Power in this new system. How are we going to make sure that we distribute power? Because see, one of those dominant cultural norms is power hoarding. But see, in the new world, we want to share power. We need to have folks that are willing to see their power, to step out of those positions and make sure that power is distributed across everyone, that everyone has their own agency. We need to have shared power in our new world. Then we want to think about where are folks living in this new world? Are we going back to having folks to living near all of these factories and places where there's a lot of pollution? Or are we making sure that we're building the kind of communities that have clean and safe air for folks to breathe? Yeah. Are we making sure that we're having folks living in places that are not filled with violence? Are we making sure that we have places that people can thrive in, the communities that they have walkable sidewalks? Yeah, that's important. Are we making sure that folks are living in places that they can get to groceries and get to the kind of the healthy groceries that they need every single day? That's the new world that we want to live in. And are we making sure in this new world that people are connected to others in a way that they feel comfortable, in a way that they can take the services that are offered to them because they are culturally responsive, that they are walking into services where people see them, where they get them, where they don't have to explain themselves over and over and over again. See, that's the new world that we want to live in. And then finally, in this new world, there has to be new accountability. Because see, in this old world, the accountability was only to those folks who had money, the folks who had hoarded power. But see, in this new world, in this new system that we're going to build together, accountability has to be to all of us. Accountability has to be to the people that we say that we're serving, that come into our homeless response system every single day, that are working to get into different kinds of housing. That's who we should be accountable to, not to the folks that are dangling money in front of us, not to the folks that are trying desperately to hold on to that power and hoarding it and trying to keep it with everything that they have, even in ways that are harmful and illegal. No, we cannot be accountable to that kind of nonsense, that kind of brutality any longer. We must be accountable to each other. This new coalition that we have built together, that's who we must be accountable to. And so in closing, I want you to remember that transformation is possible. It is possible, but it is only possible if we stay together, if we work together, if we continue this big, beautiful coalition that we formed over these last months. Because see, it will be hard. So we will need to lean on each other. We will need to lean on each other in those times when folks are coming against us with everything they have, when they're trying to hold on to that power, when they're using all of their brutal tactics to hold on. We will need to stick together in community, in coalition, and fight back every single day. We cannot let one day go when we are not resisting, when we're not fighting back, when we're not fighting for a new future, a better future, a transformed future. So I'll leave you with these words that we started with. Change fixes the past, but transformation creates the future. And so today, I want you to join me in creating that new future. Thank you.